You take it away, Kim. Awesome. Okay, you guys, I'm here to welcome Amanda and learn from Amanda right along with you guys. Today is going to be a pretty special episode, and all that we have done with these things. We have recorded all of the sessions, and we're going to be making those available to folks to come back in and watch those as PLCs, however they want to do that, and everything. We're incredibly blessed and fortunate to have Amanda. But something I have not done, in all these sessions that we've done, and you guys see this thing right here. I have not really intentionally connected folks before we talked about them to their economic standards. So before she goes into everything that she's going to talk about, because I can't see part of these, I want you all to look at the screen and just see, because these are all of your standards. You see there's macro, micro, the whole thing. And as you guys look at them, and unfortunately, the fourth grade one has just a little bit of extra space there in between. And you guys can see that in the fourth grade, you're only going to see four, not counting the Kentucky part, but you're going to see four concepts and practices. But in fifth grade, the game ups a little bit. Okay. And that kind of thing, by the way that you look at them, they get a little bit, no, they both have the five. Okay. I was looking at it the wrong way. See, even it's throwing me off. But the big thing I want you guys to look at is look at those key terms, look at the goals of those standards, look at that verb, and especially know. And so everything you see with this today, and if you even, I should go off camera. Hopefully you won't get me, but I would love it if you would take a screenshot of this and have that really close the entire time she talks, because you're going to hear all of these things being done. You're going to, especially as she goes through, because today she's going to be using primary sources. And I think that's the thing in the sessions where she has shared resources and lessons. Those have been phenomenal because there's stuff there now for us to teach economics. To me, economics is the hardest thing that we teach as social studies folks, because there is such a component in our, I think even in our mentality, that this is a business driven thing. When in reality, we as human beings, we are the ones that drive the economy. I think businesses respond. I know that's probably wrong, Amanda. So
No,
correct me in a
you're
minute.
actually right. I mean, businesses are all owned by households, so
There you go.
individuals and
Yeah.
households are really driving this.
Yeah. So because they're not going to open a business if people ain't going to buy it. So anyway, so if you, now that you guys have taken the screenshot, have that close by. I'm going to stop sharing and just kind of disappear. But you guys, this is Amanda Grieger from the Federal Reserve. And I'm not going to talk another second because everything that she says is the most important thing you'll hear today. So y'all, thank you so much for being here. Hit it, Amanda. And I'm going to go off camera because I tend to do facials. Like I'm listed and I'm like, oh, yeah, kind of stuff. And it distracts people. So I'm just going to disappear for a second.
That's okay. I'll tell you, I do the same thing. Sometimes I have to turn my camera off in meetings because I have a very loud face. And I don't, I don't mean to, but my reactions come out right out of the gate. So let me just briefly, let me start with my official disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation are mine and do not necessarily reflect any official policy position of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis or the Federal Reserve System. So you're quoting Amanda today, not the Fed said, okay? Before we dive in, some of you, I think, have been on workshops with me before, and some of you haven't. So I just wanted to keep this brief. I've been with the Federal Reserve of St. Louis for 2 years now. And before that, I was a classroom teacher for over 12 years. So I taught high school. And so I know my fourth and fifth grade, bless you is what I say, because my mom is a fourth grade teacher. Yeah. So it's such a fun group, but they have they present there's some real challenges there. I know fifth grade is one of your tested years. Where I'm from in Florida, fourth grade is the heavy tested year. And so you've got a lot of test preparation. Like I hate to say pressures, but you've got a lot of competing things for your attention. Their kind of emerging personalities and ability to understand sarcasm is starting to come out. You got a full plate. But I spent most of my career in a public high school in Florida, in an urban area. I moved to town, is what everybody where I'm from says. But I grew up in a small town. I went to a pre-K 8 school. I graduated with 64, the standard small town. How many kids in your high school? So I've seen kind of the gamut of educational environments, and I always, always, always enjoy my work with Kentucky. Um, I just really love it there. I think some of it's because y'all sound like home, and some of it is I just love the energy that the teachers give, even in this virtual environment. So, for today, just to kind of walk you through where we're going and a couple of encouragements for you. So, I taught through the pandemic, which means the black boxes and long pauses does not bother me at all. I, it's fine. So, like, the other thing I want you to know is that this is a completely safe learning space. I think sometimes as teachers, we feel this pressure to know, but everybody has to learn sometime. I'll tell you a very short story about my niece. I went home for a visit and she was bemoaning that I had moved so far away. Like, why is one of her favorite questions. She's 6 and I'm on her way to being an investigative journalist. She really hits you with these questions. And she's like, well, what is your job? And I was trying very hard to describe it to her. And I finally just said, I teach teachers. And she looked at me like I was so full of it. She's like, teachers already know. And I was like, okay, well, all right. First of all, you're not wrong. But also but I told her, I was like, well, everybody had to learn sometime, including your teachers. So this is your kind of safe space to ask questions. If you have an example you've been using with the standards, feel free to put it in the chat. Feel free to come off mute. I don't mind interruptions. My plan is for this to be very conversational and very kind of informal. We're going to start with just kind of the foundational concept, like what is economics built on? And then we're going to go kind of slowly-ish through economic patterns that you can use with your standards. And I'm going to use some pulled release questions from your social studies test to kind of highlight how these are playing out. And then once you have this nice foundation to pull from and some language to use, we're going to go through 2 examples from your primary document requirements. We're going to do Mayflower Compact, and then we're going to do just some lines from the Declaration of Independence, right? Because I know for most of your students, you're really not, you're not necessarily using the whole document. We're going to take it kind of line by line, how you can have a discussion with your students and kind of lay some foundational work to use later. And I've got some sample lesson plans from from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis to kind of share with you for you to use as well. So feel free to ask questions. Feel free to come off mute whenever you like. And honestly, throw answers out there, throw samples out there in the chat. This is your opportunity to get feedback, right? And to get, sometimes I just like other people to confirm that my examples are right. I even do that with my colleagues. I'm like, don't you think this is kind of like that? And they'll say, yes, that's a perfect example. Not that I didn't know it, but it just makes you feel better to be sure. So consider this your confidence booster. So we're going to start with an example I've done with some other webinars. This one is You Get to Be Captain America Today. Yeah, you. And okay, hold on a second. There you go. Okay, are y'all seeing a PowerPoint on your screen? Okay, good. Sorry, mine is decided to act up and get pixely. So if it disappears, somebody please come off and tell me. So you get to be Captain America. You need to go save the world, but you only have room in your vehicle for one other superhero Avenger. You've looked at everybody lined up, and you've mentally narrowed it down to these 2 choices. You're either going to take the Hulk or you're going to take Black Panther. Now, that's all the information you get. You know what you got to face to save the world. You decided these are the best 2 choices. Think about it for a second, and then in the chat, I want you to tell me who you're picking. If you're in the room with someone, you can tell them too. You can turn to a partner and tell them. But who are you taking with you to save the world? Put it in the chat for me. I know you're like, you didn't choose one of my favorite Avengers. The audacity. I know, but let's pretend these are the last 2 choices. So you're Captain America. So pick Hulk or Black Panther.
You got a Hulk.
Okay. Okay, Julie. It's not a bad reason, right? You just know more about that one. I have missed the last, probably. I didn't mean to miss so many, but now I feel like I can't go because I've missed so many. Okay. All right. Oh, please, no, not the Hulk, because he might break the car. Okay, this is all fair, right? Okay, so for the vast majority, it feels like we're going with the Hulk. And I love that you went ahead and put your rationale in there because the Hulk is either maybe a choice you want because you kind of know what you're getting. That's your incentive is the known, the information. Some of you said not the Hulk because his powers might break your vehicle, which is fair. I would not let him ride with me in my Kia. I'm really attached to that car. I needed to keep going for at least 8 more years. So if you chose the Hulk, right, this is essentially economics in a nutshell. You did it, okay? Economics is the study of decisions. And then, so of course, the natural question is why do people have to make decisions? So, like, why am I forcing you in this scenario? Why am I saying you can only take one? Like, what's causing this choice? Why can you only take one according to the scenario I set up for you? Mm-hmm. Yeah. By choosing one, you're definitely giving up another, but why can't you take both in our scenario? What's limited here? Yeah, Julie, no room in the car, right? So in this case, right, the reason you have to make a choice is because your resource is scarce, the resource being your car. You only have room for one, so it's forced you to make a choice, right? So economics is the study of how people make those choices and what are the consequences. The reason people have to make those choices is because of scarcity, right? So scarcity, you can't always get what you want, is another way to put that. Scarcity is this idea that resources are limited, and because of that, we're forced to make choices. There are infinite combinations of things that we want. There are infinite numbers of like possibilities in most cases, but you can't have like you don't have the resources for everything. Even something as simple as like the way we measure time, right? You are with me on this webinar, which means you are not at the beach. You are not watching a show you like. I mean, you could be. This is the Zoom world we live in. You could be doing both. But like if you're here with me, you're not doing whatever your second choice would have been, right? And that's because of scarcity. You have one time block here, and you've chosen to spend it in this webinar for professional development. So the opportunity cost is the options you don't pick, and the incentives are that kind of rationale for why you picked what you picked. So every decision you make can be broken down into these three components, right? You've got your choice, you've got the reason you chose it, your incentive, and then you've got the opportunity cost, the thing you didn't pick. Now, I'll tell you in economics, one of the reasons why I only give you two choices is because economics, like any social or other kind of science, is about measurement, right? And observing behaviors to try to understand. So there's no way, like it would be way too clunky and almost impossible to try to measure infinite possibilities for every choice. So what we do as a discipline is we just look at what's the top two. And then by measuring the way people interact with those top two, you can really understand the behavior and the patterns without getting super bogged down in all of the infinite possibilities, right? So for some of you in your chat, your incentive was just what you knew. My incentive was this is a known entity. I've got a better choice, like chance of this coming out like I think because I know this person. Or some of you chose Black Panther because of trying to avoid a negative consequence. I don't want the Hulk to break my vehicle. Okay, incentives can be positive and negative. Any law, and we'll talk about this with the Mayflower Compact, any law is based on the idea of incentives, right? Mostly to avoid negative incentives. I don't go 100 miles an hour down the highway, one, because that's not safe, but more importantly, I'm trying to not get a speeding ticket. Okay, that's me avoiding a negative consequence. In your classroom rules, they're probably based on negative consequences as well, though you may have some positive one too, right? So positive incentive is when I think I'm going to gain something, like I'm going to come to this webinar because I'm going to learn all about economics. It's going to be awesome. Okay, positive. Sometimes the things we choose are to avoid a negative consequence, like I'm not going to skip the mandatory faculty meeting because my principal has started taking attendance. And then he emails me passive aggressively. Those true stories. Okay. All rules are essentially based on this idea. Now, opportunity cost, I'll tell you, is the hardest concept that we're going to talk about today for students to grasp. There's a lot of reasons for this. One is because they automatically think the thing they should be labeling is the thing they pick. The other is is impartial, you know, some of it's cognitive development, right? The ability to kind of project forward like that. So the more practice you can give them with these terms, especially opportunity cost, the better off you are, right? So even if you're giving them a simple choice like, you know, should we, this is a classroom management strategy I used to do with my students. If sometimes by the time I get to fifth or sixth period, and I've already done it a bunch of times, I run a little short because at that point I'm really efficient. So I'm like, well, shoot, we got 10 minutes left and I'm definitely not going to leave you to your own devices. So I tell them they, you know, they have a choice. You know, we can do this or we can do this. I'm happy with both choices. But I let them think that they're getting something really good, right? But even if when it's simple like that, I say, well, okay, well, if you picked this, then what was your opportunity cost? The other thing, okay? Is everybody okay with that vocabulary? Do we feel pretty good about scarcity, incentive, and opportunity cost? We're feeling pretty good about it. Okay, fabulous. We're going to go into a bunch of examples, so don't worry about that. The first resource I want to share, and I'm going to put this link in the chat. I know there is also in the resource folder, I went ahead and I put all of these links together for you on one page. But the first thing I wanted to share with you is our Explore Economics video series. I think this is one of the best products that we have. Okay. All of our products are there's no monetary cost to them. They're completely monetarily free. Okay. I'm very careful to say monetarily free because I work in a research division and you want to see economists get riled up, use the word free. They're like, nothing is free. There's always resources thrown out and I'm telling you, you can get them really wound up. There's no monetary cost to our resources. They're monetarily free. So this video series really just takes a single concept and follows it through with examples that your students can understand and also that you can refer back to. So on that website, you'll see that we have topics like, if you're looking at your standards, we have topics like consumers and producers, where we're labeling what those two are. We've got one on productivity, like what does that mean? Which from a historical standpoint becomes really important when we start to talk about productivity often has a lot to do with like capital, whether that's tools or whether that's knowledge. And so when we look at like historical developments like the Industrial Revolution, a lot of that was about taking a skill and building a machine or a tool to do it, right? Which meant the knowledge need shifted. It wasn't about knowing how to make that thing anymore. It was about knowing how to fix the machine that made the thing, right? And so that one can be good too. There's one on scarcity and there's several on here that relate to trade. So bookmark that for later. We are going to watch scarcity just to give you an example what you can do with your students and to give you a taste for these videos. And then we're going to go into some of these patterns to watch for and looking at the way your standards put together. Okay. All right.
Class, we have something important to talk about today.
What is it, Miss Mazzaros?
You all know there's an empty lot next
Oh, I'm so afraid of this. Okay, we're going to do our very best today, but
to our school. You can see it.
I'll let it buffer for a second and just see. If it doesn't, I'm just going to tell you what happens in the video and how wonderful it is. I'm going to give it a second to get ahead of me. Okay. Let's try again.
Out of our window.
Yes, we can. Who owns that land?
Well, the school owns the land, and the school board has been trying to decide what to do with it. We need more parking space, but we need a larger playground space too.
We want the playground, right, everyone?
Well, it was a hard choice for the school board. Land is scarce, you know.
What does scarce mean?
Remember? We talked about it in economics. It means there isn't enough land for us to have everything we want.
That's right, Cameron. Land is a scarce resource, and the school board wanted more parking and a larger play area. But they only have enough land for one of those two things. They decided that they want to use the land to provide more play area.
Yeah!
Yes, this is exciting. When things are scarce, people must make choices. The school board chose to have a larger playground. They gave up additional parking space. Remember, when we make a choice, the next best thing we give up is our opportunity cost. The next best thing the school board gave up was having a parking lot. That's their opportunity cost. Now, we have another problem. What equipment should be on the playground? What kind of playground should it be? I think that's a problem we should think about. What are things you'd like to see on a new playground?
Swings,
Slides!
Climbing ropes,
Basketball hoop,
bridge,
seesaw,
monkey bars,
tubes.
Sandbox!
merry-go-round.
space for a 4-square court.
That's a lot of stuff. I think that we have unlimited wants for the playground. I'm not sure how much of what we want we can actually have. The land is scarce.
That means we do not have enough space for everything. We need to measure so that we can find out the area of the land, right?
Yes! We learned about area in math class.
Yes, I remember that. We'll need a long tape measure. Maybe the custodian can help with that.
While some of us are measuring the land, others can search online to find out how much space is needed for the things on our list of wants. For example, how much space is needed for a cool slide? And how much space is needed for a 4-square court? Great job, everyone! Now we have measured the land and we found out how much space each of our playground wants will take. What do you think?
I think we have a scarcity problem.
Darn! That means we can't have everything we want for the playground.
We'll have to choose which things we want.
And the next best things we give up will be our opportunity costs.
That's right, Thomas.
You are all correct. Remember, our wants for goods and services are unlimited, but the resources we need to produce goods and services are limited. That means there's scarcity, and we must make choices. When we choose, we give up something. The next best thing we give up is our opportunity cost.
We have lots of information to help us make choices.
The kids shared their ideas for the playground with the school board. The school board recognized the scarcity problem and made some choices based on the information the kids provided. And now there's a beautiful new playground. Check out one of these videos for more lessons.
So one of the things, so looking at your standard, what it wants you to do is for 4th grade, it wants you to take this idea of incentives and opportunity costs and tie it to like migration patterns. And then in 5th grade, it wanted you to take it and then apply it to just examples from history, right? So before you can really do that with them, this video is a really good way to introduce the vocabulary because land is the easiest one as an entry example of scarcity because they understand physical space. If this is being used for our class, this room can't also be the cafeteria, right? It can be as simple as that. I put a desk right here in our classroom, which means I didn't have room for a bookcase. Like they understand spatial awareness. And then in the example with the school, this is an example they can connect to, right? If we extended the playground, we had a little bit of extra room. Could we put everything in there? Like what would you want to put in that space, kids? And they'll give you 100 answers and you say, okay, well, can we have all of these? No, there's not enough room. You've just taught them scarcity, right? So then you walk them through the next step. Okay, well, how could we choose? And then you might get into incentives like They may say, well, we already have swings, so we don't need this other thing that's like a swing. Let's have something brand new. Or there's always a line at the 4 square court. We should add another one, because now you're getting into demand, right? There's so much demand and not enough supply. So you can take a simple example that they would understand from even your own classroom or school and layer in the vocabulary, and then they'll be ready to start identifying examples of it later in your social studies curriculum, right? And when we get to the historical documents and some of the examples of these patterns, you'll start to see like how you can tie in those specific examples. But this is a really great video just to introduce the vocabulary, okay? And you can take some of the, even just some of the tools, right? If you said, okay, get them, let's take that a little bit more space in your playground. If you had them list all of the things they might want on the board, and you said, okay, let's get it down to what do we think are our top 2. You have them put the top 2 up. You decide which one you're going to do. You could do that by a simple vote. You could do that by saying, okay, let's look at the cost. If you wanted them to research a little bit, whatever you decide your ultimate decision-making factor is, then it's really simple, right? You say, okay, well, which one do we pick? You circle it. So which one's our opportunity cost? You put an X or the other one. Opportunity cost you mark with an X, the choice you mark with a circle. And now you've got kind of an annotation that you could use when you give them worksheets. You could say, okay, well, let's look for examples of scarcity. When we find them, okay, well, which one what did they choose? Circle it. What was the opportunity cost? You put an X on it, something they didn't use, right? So I really love these videos, and I use them at all levels, even all the way up to our college content, because our elementary stuff is our best stuff, I think, because it's never more simple or as direct as it is for elementary audiences, right? Okay. I think you get that I really love these videos.
You can also subscribe for more content.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Okay, here we go. You're very familiar with your inquiry standards. I will be honestly coming from Florida. So when I moved up here, so the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis serves 7 different states, which means I had to get familiar with multiple new standards. And you guys were kind of new in your standards adoption with your inquiry standards. And so there was, when I first printed them out, I still remember my gut reaction was like, holy cannoli, this is a lot of pages. But the more time I've spent with it, the more I can appreciate how they have tried to consolidate these concepts, because they're so interconnected. Anyway, instead of like pulling them out and teaching them separately, it gives you this opportunity to kind of take a more holistic look at things, but it's still very challenging. Okay. And I'll tell you, particularly for your students with the econ standard, the thing I heard the most from school districts when they started to get their results back from the test is that the econ strand is where they feel they need the most support, right? Or the most opportunities to grow. And part of that, I'll tell you, is because of how your standards are written. Okay, I want to give you a little bit of like, this is real talk analysis, and again, Amanda's opinion. But one of the challenges with the econ standards is because the questions, rightly so, use the language of the standard and how they're written. However, economics as a discipline is more present predictive. It's about looking at what's happening now and kind of predicting outcomes or potential consequences in the future. All of your other standard strands, geography, civics, history, are about identifying patterns by looking to the past, right? So it's like kind of past tense looking backwards versus a present tense looking forward. And when you're all talking about the same like historical stimulus document, that can get really challenging in the wording. And so you kind of got two challenges here. The first is just the content, like it is on any test. And then the other challenge is sometimes in the tense of the wording of the econ questions. It's almost a little bit of decoding. Your students first have to figure out what am I being asked, and then they have to understand the concept and answer the question. Okay, Kim, I think you wanted to add something to that.
It's not so much add, but as much as it is, we've got to explain that to the students, because I also believe, and I hope that as teachers hear you say that in all these trainings, and sometimes we do have some crossover, or cross-pollination, as folks call it sometimes. So there's a few people that have heard this, for the second time. And I think if we could emphasize that, and by the way, this slide she's got up right now, you all, blew my mind the first session that we ran when I saw this. I was like, oh my God, this is the way that we have got to teach kids economics, these 4 questions or these 4 points. But anyway, I think that this is the thing about that, that for us to understand how economics approaches things will help us as teachers, you know?
Mhm. Yeah. When you're looking, and I'll say this too, like, and I'll be very upfront with you guys. The first release question I ever saw, I think it was a 5th grade one, or an 8th grade one. I definitely remember it being not the high school one. I like mentally, of course, said, oh, I think the answer is C. And then I looked at the thing, it was not C, it was B. And I was like, what? So then I went back and like read it really, really close and tight. And I realized that I had misunderstood the question. I was like, oh, I see what and I'm a professional. I do this stuff, I've been teaching economics for years. So I was like, I can see why this could be potentially hard for teachers to adjust to, right? So one of the things, one of the approaches I want to talk to you about today is what's on the screen. And I'd love for you to take a screenshot of it to reference later when we get to some of the documents. But it's this idea of like boiling the stimulus down to its most basic form. Like, okay, who is making a decision and what is that decision? And then taking it and labeling the parts. Okay, this was the choice. What were the incentives? And then here's where you got to adjust it a little bit for a historical perspective. It's not so much about, which one should they choose, because it's history. You know what they chose, right? I'll tell you, when we're working with the Declaration of Independence, a very popular, class activity with this is like, would you sign the Declaration of Independence? And particularly the younger they are, of course they think they would sign the Declaration of Independence because they already know how this worked out. It's very hard for them to imagine, no, I wouldn't want this to work. Like they're too young to process that that they could have feel differently and have different knowledge than they have right now in this moment, right? So that's not necessarily the most effective way to do it. But what if you said, okay, well, what were the incentives for why they signed? And then you look at history and say, okay, well, did that work out? Is what they thought would happen when they made the choice, is that what actually happened? Why or why not? And that's still economic, but it's giving you an easier for them to contextualize kind of framework of just like, okay, who's making a choice? What were their options? You got choice, opportunity, cost, and then say, okay, well, consequences. Did that work out like they thought it would? Yes or no? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. Sometimes the answer is sort of, right? And so you can still give them that historical pattern searching, but use an economic language to like really tie it in, okay? Now, in terms of like, I know I just said, do long-term consequence analysis, and you probably went like, with 4th grade, so easy for you to say. I mean, long-term for a 4th grader is, last school year. They're, it's the statistical percentage of their life. So that being said, I wanted to just give you a list of patterns that you could use. Okay, so this 6 are economic patterns, and again, take a screenshot of this because we're going to use this the rest of the workshop together. When you're looking at that long-term consequences, or you're looking for a pattern, like an economic pattern in history, I would love to play a party game with you that is basically like, I could tie it to any of these 6. Okay. I do have a game that I love, which is Economics and Everything, which is where friends usually give me an example of something. They're like, there's no economics in this. And I'm like, And then I school them. There's lots of economics in everything. I'm a great time at parties. I'm sure you're dying to invite me over, but my friends are mostly used to it. I say mostly used to it. They gave me, you know what a swear jar is? Mine gave me a jar that says I talked about economics when it was an ass jar. They like me. I promise they do like me. Okay, so these 6, we're going to go through each of these 6, and I'm going to give you some historical and current examples just to illustrate it. And this is the part where I really want you to ask questions, or if you think of an example and you want to check it or you want to share it, put it in the chat. Okay, the more examples you have on hand, the better you can respond in the moment to your student. Okay, I'm getting excited because my hands are starting to go. All right, now we're going to jump in here, and I interspersed them with some released questions so you could see how these apply. We're going to start with scarcity leads to choices. Okay. This is a land example. This is a quote from Teddy Roosevelt about the creation of the National Park Service. The National Park System is one of honestly, I think it's one of the greatest achievements of the United States. I think it's one of the best things we've ever done. And honestly, I'd put it up there, right? So the National Park Service is a really easy one, tying it back to that land example, because there's only so much land. So if we make this a national park, this can now not be houses, okay? Or if it's protected forests, okay, then it cannot be an interstate. If the land has been declared it's going to be conserved, right, it means you can't put anything else on it. That's scarcity. There's only so much land. And so the opportunity cost is whatever they would have put on there. Yosemite's probably a really good one because there's a lot of urban sprawl in California. Honestly, you can pick an example. I grew up in a national forest, so that was a pretty common thing that would happen, is that people's lands would butt up against the national forest. And so it was really easy for people to say, like, oh, well, yeah, they had to stop the cattle they were running, or they had to stop the bees they were putting out because that's not their land anymore. Like, they understood this idea of, if that is government owned land, or if it's being used as part of the national park or a state park, then you can't do what you were going to do even right next to it, right? So we've already kind of talked about this one, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. Choices always have an opportunity cost. The easiest one, guys, is the road non-traveled. Every time you pick a path, there is a path you didn't take. Okay, so there's always an opportunity cost. With historical figures, if they, we did a session in this series where we looked at letter from Birmingham jail. MLK went to Birmingham, so he was not in Atlanta. Atlanta was his opportunity cost, or Jackson was his opportunity cost, right? The colonists decided to, to land in the New England area. That means they didn't land in this like Southeast Gulf region. Okay, and there were settlements down there. They were owned by different countries, and then you can get your geography into play. But the migration is like, if you look at where different European populations settled, they had an opportunity cost. By choosing to settle in one place, they did not go to another. Opportunity cost. Okay. Okay. Then we have incentives matter. This is my favorite historical example. This is there was a glass factory in the former Soviet Union. And if you remember from the Soviet Union, they tried under communism to have what was called a command economy, meaning that instead of the market-based economy we have, where like prices are determined by demand, supply and demand, and like how they interact with each other, the government just said, okay, this is the price of this thing. Your job is this, your job is that. Everybody had a job, but it wasn't necessarily like a job that anybody wanted what you were producing. So the glass factory, they said, okay, well, how do we set the prices for the glass? And the first round, the government said, okay, well, we'll pay you. Yeah, this is a window factory. We'll pay you for every pane of glass that you make. So they made glass that was so thin that it cracked every time they tried to move it, basically, because it was so thin. But they were getting paid by the pane of glass. So the thinner, the more you could make. That was the incentive. So then the government came back and they said, okay, well, actually, we'll pay you by the pound. So then they made it so thick that it was basically useless as a window, because, one of the key characteristics of a window is you can see through it. So then it's so thick that it's basically useless because you can't see through it. So the incentives matter, and they affect our choices. Even when your students are a little bit young for this, like when they get to high school, you start to look at incentives for like, where do you want to, like, what do you want to do after high school? Do you want to go to work? Do you want to try a trade profession? Do you want to try, college? Like, whatever your choice is, the incentives often matter, because like maybe they'll go to the trade school that offers a scholarship program, or they'll start at the mechanic shop that will pay them while they learn, right? Those incentives are there. And even in your school, now 4th, 5th, you probably don't, or maybe not quite as open and honest with them about school policies as a high school teacher can be. But your school policies have incentives attached to them, whether that is some kind of bonus pay, or if there is an incentive for, the classroom that brings in the most in the fundraiser, that's incentives. Incentives affects our behavior. Okay. All right. So that's our 3 key vocabulary. You can always bring it back down to that. How did the incentives that were available affect people's choices? That's really the question here. Okay. Okay. So to that end, we're going to take a second. This is from, I meant to write this down, and I realize now in this moment that I never went back and did that. I think this is from the 5th grade test. I think that all of my examples today are from the 5th grade test. Let me just say that. So in this example, it's got a map as your source, and then it also has a short excerpt from a historical nonfiction test. So the text is about how steamboat travel affected, came to the US in the early 1800s, and then it's talking about the location of Louisville and how it being on the river affected its relationship with New Orleans. So you'll see New Orleans on the map, you've got Louisville on the map, and then you see the 2 rivers labeled, right? So I'm going to give you just a second. I just want you to read the question. You don't have to attempt to answer it. I just want you to read it for a second. Okay, so how did the introduction of the steamboat affect economic decision-making for Kentuckians? In other words, one of the questions you can ask them here is about incentives, right? Did the incentives change with the introduction of the steamboat? Okay, you could ask them, so now it starts talking about trade opportunities, opportunity cost. You can start to see how this innovation, right, with the steamboats would actually affect people's choices. It changes the choices that people have, right? So in the answer choices, which answer do you think, well, let's talk about which one is the correct answer, and then we'll talk about the one I think is most likely your students would actually put. So what do you think the correct answer is? You can put it in the chat. You can come off mute if you like. This is one where I had to read it really close, I'll tell you. Because one of the things I've noticed with these questions is that the answer possibilities are not wrong statements. They're not incorrect statements. They just don't match the stimulus. And that's really hard. So for example, building boats rather than crops, that could be correct, right? It brought, I don't think D is correct because you don't know that it would have raised the cost of traveling by train. Although I think some students might have gotten confused by that and said, oh, well, if it's cheaper to go by boat, then it must be more expensive to go by train. But the key there is that just because you lowered the cost of one, it doesn't necessarily change the cost of the other. It's a little bit of the trick wording. But C is probably the best answer for this one, because instead of them just being able to access in the local city, they now have an inexpensive way to float those products to another city, whether that's New Orleans to Louisville or Louisville down to New Orleans, right? So putting this in the, putting a practice question like this in the context of your student, there's back knowledge here that needs to happen. They kind of need to understand that Louisville was largely agriculturally based. New Orleans was largely about access and shipping because of where it was located. That takes some back knowledge. So I would say put a question like this in your best case, but having your students actually break these apart, and it not so much being about let's choose the correct answer. You can tell them right out of the gate, C is the correct answer on this one. Why don't you think that it's D? Or why would B not be the best answer? And then you're getting them to pull evidence to say, like, well, B is a correct statement. Settlers did look for better financial opportunities in the Western frontier. That's a true statement about migration, right? But does it match the information they've been provided with this map? And the answer is no. The map is really focused on these two rivers, and it's not focused on Western migration, even though that might be a long-term consequence, right? So having them, instead of saying, hey, I want you to choose the correct answer, show them what the correct answer is and say, let's talk about why do you think B doesn't work for this question? Or why does D not work for this question? And let them approach it kind of backwards so that they really think about the way the questions are put together. Okay.
You know what I like about that? That forces them to use the vocabulary.
Yeah.
I like that. Oh my gosh.
Mm-hmm. I got to keep an eye on my time because Ken and Mary can tell you I get really excited and I get stuck in there. Okay, so this is pattern number 4. This is probably one of my favorite patterns because I just love it so much. Let me tell you about the example on the left first. So innovation, the reason you have innovation and by extension invention is that they're trying to solve some problem. And often the problem, once you reach a certain level, is just efficiency. The problem is not like, like think about the way things are now with the internet. The problem is not, I need to be able to communicate with people. Like we now have cell phones, we now have internet, we have email access that's readily available for most people. So now the changes are small. They're about how do we make that more efficient for people, right? So the green beans example, I was having dinner at my parents' house and my mom is a wonderful cook. And I was like, but I just happened to notice, I was like, Mom, what is up with these green beans? And we all started looking at them and noticed that they were all like little end pieces. Like the part of the green bean that is not traditionally like the cut in a can. I was like, Mom, all these green beans are like the ends. And we both noticed that it was strange enough that we went and looked at the can. And it was this farmhouse style. She had just thought it was on sale. She didn't look. It was farmhouse style, which is a new cut from Del Monte, it's an efficiency thing, right? So before, the ends are usually like a cast-off product. You cut the ends, you sell the beautifully trimmed green bean. And so they're looking at it and they're like, all this stuff is going to waste. What if we packaged them up and then marketed them as something, rustic, appealed to that? And then now at least we're getting something where before we were getting nothing. That's innovation. They're trying to be more efficient. I will tell you as a farm kid, that feels pretty accurate. Like the beautiful, like perfect things or more perfect things went to the market and my mom called them the uglies. we eat the uglies, right? Like, so it works. On the right is, I will fight on this hill every time. I think this is one of the greatest innovations in the last 200 years. It's the standardization of a shipping container size. I think it has revolutionized trade globally, and I'm willing to fight anybody on that hill that wants to take me on. When you standardize the size of those containers, first of all, the invention of those containers for shipping, revolutionary. Instead of us like literally stacking stuff in a boat, you've now got these boxes that you can fill anywhere and then put them on. But then when you standardize the sizes, you make it possible for them to go from ship to a rail car frame. You can also lift that up, put it on a big rig, and you have dramatically reduced the time it takes to get something from one place to another. Because now, instead of you having to have physical labor that would go move these things, or a time delay where you have to wait for something that has the right size frame to get where you are, you standardize that process. So if I have an available big rig, I put it on that trailer and off it goes. I don't have to wait for the right size to come. Efficiency, my second favorite word. Okay. All right, questions so far. Feeling pretty good about these. Okay, we're feeling pretty good. All right, we're getting to the juicy ones. Okay, trade changes relationships. I think you get this. Good, bad, it just does, right? You want to look historically, trade changed relationships. There's a lot of motivating factors for the settlers, but like, why would a country be willing to put resources into colonizing? because they're trying to get more resources, right? They want more resources so they can trade more. Why are civilizations willing to trade with each other? Because you have something that I want or need. Let's trade for it instead of me trying to make everything myself. But that changes the relationships. A lot of wars, if you look at war history, wars were fought because I wanted something you have, or you tried to take something that I had, usually resources, okay? But then a lot of wars were solved and a lot of alliances and things were made when you have these deep trade relationships. The United Nations is basically built on this principle. The United Nations has no military component. They have no enforcement authority other than economic peer pressure. If you comply with the rules, we trade with each other. If you don't, we put economic sanctions on you and we don't trade with you. And you let those economic consequences create pressure to get the behavior you're trying to get. That's how the UN basically works, right? Trade changes your relationships. You're unlikely to go to war with a trading partner that you're dependent on. Take it down to a micro level. If you look at the ways like civilization has developed, it starts very like familial based, right? Whether that's feudal or not feudal, but like tribal. And it starts very small. And then once you have the ability to start trading, whether that's because you have access to roads or because you start to interact with people, you start to see these relationships change. They have access to products they didn't have before. It changes the way that ideas spread. If you look at a map of the Silk Road in world history, and then you look at a map of something like the spread of Buddhism, you'll notice there's a lot of overlap. Because when people travel, they weren't just taking stuff. They took ideas, they took ways of thinking. Some of them took themselves and they would settle in new places, and it changes the environment where they're in, right? So trade changes relationships. Okay, last one. And I will say this one is probably the most complex for your students. Policy, and so policy by definition is just a governing body creates like a rule or a guideline, right? So a policy is like a rule or a guideline by a governing body. So it can be a dress code at your school, that's a policy. Whenever they pass a law, it can be a big law, like the Social Security Act. Those are policies. A governing body says, here's how we're going to do this thing, and here's the guideline. Whenever they do that, there's an intended outcome they're trying to get. And that can create consequences, sometimes intended and sometimes unintended, right? So for example, like take a dress code at your school. The intended, there is an intended outcome. They've got this incentive. They want to make sure, usually they say that it's about like distractive behavior. That's usually what dress codes are based on, right? Obscenity on t-shirts, too much exposed skin, etc. That's the intended outcome. So does it do that? The unintended consequences that sometimes those policies can cause inequality in how they are applied. They tend to be much more restrictive or have much more guidelines around women than men. Some of that's just unavoidable with societal standards, but the enforcement tends to much more heavily be against female students than male students. It also can be differently applied on different body types. It also creates inequity within your school because like some teachers, like I had a teacher in my school, she was like about dress code. She was every person, every time. She was like, that was the thing she checked for every morning. And I'm going to be very honest with you, that was very low on my like list of things. Okay, because I had a lot of other stuff I needed to do with me that day. So it just, it can lead, that's the unintended consequence. And all policies have intended consequences and unintended consequences because they change the incentives. Policies have incentives in place to basically get people to follow the behavior or to get them to not do something, right? And then that changes. There are unintended consequences of those changing of incentives. I give you an example. Prohibition is a really good example of this. Prohibition is a constitutional amendment where a minority special interest was able to use the system to get this amendment passed that banned alcohol, right? Sale, and then of course with that consumption of alcohol. The intended consequence was we're going to reduce alcohol sales, and it did that. The unintended consequence was it actually led to a fairly dramatic increase in underage drinking and in alcohol-related deaths and injuries. because now there was no regulatory piece. The incentive to, like, nobody's going to report underage drinking because they're going to say, how do you know that? Or they're going to say, they're not going to say, oh, I got alcohol from so-and-so, and they sold it to my underage teenager. They're not going to say that because your underage teenager also broke the law, right? So it changed the incentive there. The reporting function on that basically disappeared because there was no way to be involved in it without outing yourself as being involved in illegal activity. Same thing with the alcohol industry. Because there was no longer any regulation, I can't go say, hey, this store sold me moonshine that made me blind. I can't do that because I broke the law. So now there's no quality control, right? So the intended consequence was met. They wanted to reduce alcohol sales in the United States. They did. The unintended consequence of not having any regulation on that was that you also had an increase in underage drinking and in alcohol-related injuries. Okay, I went really fast through that. Are we feeling pretty good about these patterns? Because we're going to look at another sample question now. Okay, now we're to the good stuff. Now we're looking at the... Okay, let me give you a second to just review this question. I went still 5th grade test, but I went another year back. And the style on this question changed. And I think if I knew more about the history of your test, this might have been the first year with the new standard. So it was like a test year, or this might have been like the last year before they changed, but it holds. So let me give you a second to read this question.
I'm so glad you picked this. When they finish, I have some.
Yeah. Okay. Here's what I want you to do with this one. I don't want you to answer the question. I want you to tell me which of the 6 patterns you could connect it to, and I will tell you right now there are multiple. But when you read this question, if you wanted to look at a pattern with your students off that list, which one do you think you could make the strongest connection to? And your answers are very likely to be different from each other based on your personal teaching styles. But of those 6, and pop it in the chat for me. I don't know if I'm saying it right. SCAGs, scarcity leads to choices. It's a good one, right? Taking it down to its most basic level. If you're producing rubber, you're not producing other things. There's a good opportunity cost argument here too that might be a little bit more complicated for your students than you want to go into, but you can ask them, like, why didn't the US produce rubber? And then you're getting into things like comparative advantage. Like, we had other resources that we were better at producing stuff with, so we tended to do that and traded for the other. There's also incentives, right? The incentive before was to make something else. And now you have these rubber factories. So after it, more private businesses popped up because they're like, hey, you can do this. Or there were government subsidies for it. Policy creates unintended and intended consequences. That's a good one. The intended consequence of this policy was we need rubber for the war effort. The unintended consequence is that it shaped an industry in Kentucky. Right? Yeah, innovation. Kim, you wanted to add on to this question? These are all great, guys. You're right on.
I had a lengthy discussion with a district person once talking about this question, because when it came out in the released items, so, when you look at it initially, and this was the first thing that was said, the first sentence says, this source is about the impact of World War II in Kentucky. Now, you 5th grade folks are sitting out there and it's like, okay, World War II's not our standards. World War II's not our standards. And that's what this person said. That's how the email started when we started this discussion. And they're right. That's in my standards as a high school teacher. It's not even in 8th grade. And it's not in 7th grade when there's world history, because they stop at 1600. But, and when I tell you guys some of the standards that apply to this actually relates to 2nd/3rd grade, because especially, and even 1st grade, when you talk about Kentucky as a state, because one of the unintended consequences of this happening is that the population of Louisville blew up. And that's what we talk about is in 1st grade, we talk about our big cities. Okay. Louisville's our biggest city. That's going to be established. Then when they get into second grade, they're talking about North America, then they're going to be talking about, in terms of urban versus rural. And this is definitely urban. So we're going to help our kids understand that. So you guys see what I'm saying? So that's why that's in there. And then when you get there with third grade, well, then you're talking about, bigger impacts and stuff. But I love how you're bringing, so now that you have her information and now you see what I'm saying here, getting our kids to really understand urban areas, but most importantly, our biggest urban area. And here you go, it's Louisville. So that's how that thing got in there. Because you got to remember, our test is largely skill based. Excuse me, I didn't mean to say test. From the practice test and the released items, you see the skill base there. And I'm going to hush.
Well, no, it's a really great point, right? Because most likely ones it's automatically kind of prime the students that some of these other things might be correct statements, right? But I will tell you, if you look at this thing, it's not down here until you get to the last two sentences that it actually starts to relate to the answer choice that is correct. So they have to process all of this information and then at the end pick up what Kim has mentioned they learned about Kentucky history, that Louisville is the largest city, right? Or what they've learned about migration from the fourth grade standard is that people tend to go where the jobs are. And so if the jobs from government policy incentive are being built in these cities, people are going to follow that, right? So that's the actual practical application of that pattern that people, like if you're looking at unintended consequences, the government's thing was we need rubber for the war effort. The unintended consequences is that they made cities more attractive because that's where the jobs were. And you see this across the country after World War II, right? You have this big urban shift because that's where the factories jobs were, right? So, okay, great job. You guys are awesome at this. Okay, now we're going to get into our two primary sources. We're so excited. I'm not gonna lie to you, it has been a long time since I read the Mayflower Complex, or really honestly gave it much thought. Okay. Even when I was teaching, I was a government teacher, and so we started, I touch on Magna Carta and then we'd whip ahead to, Declaration of Independence. But it's good stuff. It is short, which is nice for your fourth grade things. Now, we're not gonna read this. This is the background of the Mayflower. I know you know it. I know you get it. Okay, this is really more in here so that you have it later with the slides if you want to pull pieces apart from it. I got this from the Mayflower Society, just to cite my source, but it's a good background for your student that this idea that they had charters from the government, and then when they decided to do this new colony, part of the reason they had the Mayflower Compact was they actually didn't have the legal paperwork that they usually had. So instead of waiting for the king to send one, they said, well, we'll just all agree and we'll agree to work together on this thing. So this is really just more for reference for later, okay? This is the actual Mayflower Compact. The language is not something that I would relish approaching with fourth and fifth graders. So already out of the gate, my respect. This got some tough language in it. So what I did was I highlighted the parts that I thought were most prevalent to the economics. So if you take out the flowery language, like almost the first whole two lines is just the king's title. It's like, I got it. Gotcha. King, fancy title. Ooh. Okay. So then we come down here and he says, so having undertaken a voyage to put a new colony in the northern part of Virginia. So we want to basically expand the Virginia colony and put a new settlement in here. Do by the people who are together decide collectively that we're going to combine ourselves together into a civil body. You're going to have to explain what a body politic is to them. I know this. Basically, those of us who are here are going to all mutually agree that we're going to form a governing body to better, and then it says, okay, so that's the choice, right? We're going to identify the decision. Should we all sign together and form this compact, this social contract, or should we just say, wing it? Okay. And I'll come back to this on the slide. So then you say, okay, well, what would be the incentives for this? And now we're getting into evidence for our better ordering and preservation. Okay. We're going to make it so that we are more organized, and we're going to preserve that this will actually work and we're not just all going to devolve into fighting each other. We're going to constitute that there are some laws that from time to time we'll have to meet together, and we all agree that when we do that, we'll all abide by the rule, right? So in other words, in real people talk, they decided that collectively together, there will be times when disagreements will come up, and in order for this thing to keep working out, we agree that when those times arise, we get this organizing body together, and whatever they decide, we're all going to follow it. Even if we don't like it, we're going to do it for the better good, right? Now, let's look at how you might break that down for a student. If you had the students use what they know, right? And this is even a little bit less document dependent. You can pull context from where you are in your historical text. You can also just ask them to think about it in the context of your classroom. What's the incentive for signing this compact? Like, what's the incentive for joining this group and possibly limiting your own choices a little bit? Like, why would you go with the group instead of just continuing to do whatever you want versus just moving to an area with no agreement in place, right? So let's take, what's the incentive? So in other words, you can think of this shit as like, let's make a pro-con list. What's the pro-cons of signing this compact? You put me an example in the chat, or you can come off mute, okay? What's the incentive for signing the compact or writing this compact altogether? Okay. Okay, let me say this too, Cheryl. You've hit on a real, your kids are immediately going to say, this is going to lead to independence. And it does. I mean, eventually, right? This is kind of the beginnings of this idea that, we don't really need the king. We can kind of do this ourselves. We don't need him to send politicians. We can all kind of collectively agree what's good for us. Like, this is really where you start to see some of the roots of this idea of like self-determination and this idea of like, we know us and we know our problems. You've never even been here. Why are you telling us how to solve our problems? You don't know my problems, right? We're really starting to lay that in here. When your incentive to like, so another way to look at this kid, with your kids is like, what's the benefit of having government? Right? What does government even get you? Because that's what you're talking about. They're willingly agreed to put a governing body over themselves. So what's the positive things that you get from government? Why would you willingly give up some of your freedom for government? Yeah. Kim pulling from the document. Yeah, there's some level of protection that you're going to get, right? So basically we all agree to some limitation of our freedoms. I can't do everything I want whenever I want, but in exchange, I'm going to get protected. So if somebody comes and steals my stuff, I have somewhere to go. Or if somebody comes and punches me in the face, I have somewhere to go to get that thing. The organization is also important too, because if you have an organizing body, you spend a lot less time on things like that could be solved by understanding the rules, right? Like who's going to have land where, or where we're going to put certain things, or where your property ends and mine starts, right? So pulling the language from the document. So the short answer to this, and get them to go from the argument, is I'd go with protection. That's the easiest one they can get, right? That you have some protection that I'm already out here struggling to survive in this brand new place that we just decided to move to. I really don't need to be worried that my neighbor is going to come take my stuff every time I walk out of my house. Easy, right? So what would be the incentive then, the flip side of that? What would be the incentive for just settling? Just move into the place. We don't have the Mayflower Compact. We've all just decided to like, just gonna move here and plant my flag. What's the incentive to do it that way? Yeah, resources. If I can hold it, I can keep it, right? I could potentially get more land. I could get more autonomy. In short, right, it's the opposite of the compact. The compact gives you protection, but it costs you a little bit of independence and liberty, right? So if I do it without, I get all the liberty I want, but your opportunity cost is that protection. This is a really good one to do that circle crossout activity that we talked about, because you know that they signed the compact. So after you get your students to identify that the compact was about protection and being a little bit more organized, which in its own way is a form of protection. If everybody knows what the boundaries are, it's easier to operate, right? So if we agree on these boundaries, then we don't have to worry about them anymore. And so you're willing to give up some choices, like to limit your choices a little bit in exchange for that protection. And then on the other side is just total liberty. I can do what I want. I can have what I want. You know, I got total freedom. And so when you say, okay, well, they chose to sign the compact. So circle, the choice was to have organization and protection, and then have them cross out the like total freedom side, because that's the opportunity cost. Okay. This one's a really good binary choice, because you're all like, we're essentially talking about the whole premise of social contract, right? That you give up some liberty in exchange for protection. And so by choosing protection, you have to give up some liberty. That's the opportunity cost. If you choose total liberty, then you give up protection of a body. Circle cross out, right? This is a really, this, unlike a lot of historical examples, I'll tell you, because this one has a really clear binary choice, right? We're talking about protection versus total freedom. It's a really good one for that labeling choice, opportunity cost incentive, right? Okay. Questions while I keep going, because I am, as per usual, overexcited and talk to my times. Then you can have a conversation with them as we move through the course, and it will come up almost immediately. Did this work out like they thought? Did they have total peace and tranquility? The answer to that is no. No. But did it lead to other things? Like some of the unintended consequences, which I think it was Cheryl. So I'm sorry if I'm misquoting you from the chat. Cheryl talks about like, this is eventually going to start to lead to these attitudes that are going to be a break from England. Like, we don't need you. We can agree together, right? This idea that you'll later see quoted in the Declaration, that the governed should be the source of power, not some divine authority, is the quote from the Declaration of Independence. This is where you start to see some of the niggling introductions of that idea that like, we don't need a king. The governed should decide what they want. Okay, this is where we see it. Kim, do you want to add on while I move over to Declaration?
Oh no, you keep going. This is awesome.
Oh, okay. All right. My last little thing before I move in here is actually a connection to one of our Explore Econ videos. This one's about what's useful as money. Okay, and I know you're thinking, Amanda, that feels like a stretch. We're talking about the Mayflower Compact, and now you're talking about why do we choose stuff as money? The money system that we have now, fiat money, is a social contract. The money we use has value because we've all agreed that we're willing to take it in trade. That's social contract. So you can take this foundational idea and show them how it applies to other areas of their lives. We've all agreed that you don't get to break the classroom rules and run wild because that makes it safer for everybody. They understand social contract. Then you say, okay, well, in the economy, we also have social contract, right? Our money system, social contract, okay? We have all agreed that we'll accept dollars and cents for our goods and services, social contract, okay? Good one. Yeah, bartering is the best place to start functions of money. I will tell you. And in the video, it actually talks about bartering a little bit. If I cannot remember his name, he's trying to barter. He has fish. Yeah, you see the video. He has fish, but he's having a hard time finding people with stuff he wants that will take his fish. Right? It's a great one. Okay, we're not going to get to do all of the quotes that I pulled from the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration of Independence, what a juicy, juicy piece of documentation. The beginning part is just beautiful. I mean, it's just beautifully written, right? But then you get this laundry list of reasons. So when you're talking with your students about it, I'm sure that one of the reasons you point out to them is like, okay, they've decided to do this thing, but they're addressing this letter like it's an open letter to the world. In other words, they're not unaware that they're probably going to need support from somewhere. They're about to take on the greatest military of its time. They're like literally these colonies, they're thriving, but they definitely don't have the resources and the technology that the British military has, right? Or those resources. They're about to take that on. They're not unaware that they're going to need other support. So this letter is like saying, hey, we're not just like willy-nilly rabble rousers. We really were thoughtful about this, and we really tried hard to not have to do this. But now we have to do this. He's made us do this, and here is our laundry list of reasons why we have to do it. We tried this, he did that. We tried this, he did that. He did this to us, he did this to us, he did this to us, right? It's really a very compelling argument for why they're doing this, right? And it's not just for the international community, it's also internal, right? They really want like everybody to get on board. Like they need people to be fired up. They need people to be on the same page about it because it's the only way this thing is going to like really come down, right? So I'll tell you a fun fact about the US at this time. The literacy rates in the US were significantly higher than the average civilization in Europe at this point, or in England. I shouldn't rush. In England. So you can look at that by the number of newspapers. The number of newspapers circulating in the colonies was like triple what was circulating in England. And a lot of that goes back to their roots, right? Let's talk about incentives. A lot of colonists originally came over seeking relief from religious persecution. So now you're in this new country and you want to be able to practice your religion. Most religions have a text. You want your people to be able to read the text, to have this deeper connection to their religious traditions. So you need them to be able to read. So the incentive is I need people to read because I want them to have this, this opportunity for a religious experience. The unintended consequence, right, of this like policy of your religious leaders teaching the congregants to read is that once we get to the American Revolution, most of the population is literate. So the ability to spread information quickly, to get people on board with a single argument by using something like the Declaration of Independence is much easier in the United States than it would have been in a different place. And everything. Okay. Now I have to choose, and that's going to make this really hard. I've got migration. Ooh, okay. Let's take this one because I think it's a little bit, I think this directs really directly to, I'm sorry, I can't remember which number it was, but it's one of your fourth grade ones where you have to give examples about incentives for migration and how that works, right? Okay, so this is, I will tell you, I pulled them chronologically from the list so they would be easier for you to find in the slideshow if you decided to like match them to resources you already use. I did go chronologically through the document. So I didn't use the beginning, I just pulled from that grievance list. And what I want you to think about when you're teaching this document is like, what you're really getting your students to see is like, how did this policy or this choice by the king like change the incentives? How did it change people's ability to make decisions, right? So in this case, he is the king. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, which stopped calling ourselves colonies and now we're states, for the purpose of obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising conditions of new appropriations of land. So that's a lot of vocabulary for your students. You could translate that for them by saying, he has endeavored to prevent people from coming here. And before you go anywhere else with your student, you ask them and say, why would the states want people to move here? I know that's what I want you to talk to me about in the chat. Why would the colonies or the states at this point, why do they want people to migrate to the US or to the colonies? Okay, tell me in the chat. Yeah, right on, Cheryl. Yeah. And there's all kinds of power in numbers, right? One, economic power. More people who can work. That's a larger labor force. You can produce more money circulating. More people, more influence, right? More people, more influence. More people, more opportunity, like more people who can join your military, right? If you decide to push back about something. Okay. Or for your defense. in this case. There was we had colonial militaries to defend us because, the US, there were a lot of people here. A lot of countries had colonies. And then of course you have our you have the native populations too that are displaced. Now, that's just the first line. We haven't even gotten to what the other stuff means. Your students understand that more people, more workers, more resources, that's where we are. So then it's like, how did he do that? So the laws of naturalization are like, how do people who move here become citizens and get rights and protections? He has created laws so in order to prevent people from wanting to move here and become citizens, he has refused to pass legislation or pass laws that would encourage people to do that. So first of all, he's made it harder for people to come here and get citizenship. And he made it harder for people to get land. What is land? If you're deciding, if the choice is, do I want to move to the colonies or not? What is being able to get land? That's the incentive. So in other words, they're saying he's made the incentives harder to get. If one of the big draws of people coming here is the availability of land, something they did not have in England, a lot of scarcity. Now you got this wide open, unexplored country, right? There's economic opportunity here that isn't anywhere else. That land in this case represents the incentive. And then you type that to scarcity. Why would that be so attractive here? Because it's so hard to get in England. It's almost impossible for anybody to buy land because of the social structure and because just scarcity. It's an island. But you come here and it just seems to keep going and going and going and going. That's attractive. And so the king, he's not dumb. He says, dang, everybody's rushing over there. Let's make that less attractive. It's harder to get land. He's changing the incentives to try to change the behavior. And that has real consequences for the colonies. Less people, as Cheryl put it, less influence, less power. Right? Okay. Oh, so good, right? All right, I think I have time. I don't have time for one more. Let me just really briefly tell you how I would what these other questions mean. And then you are welcome. I have my email at the end. Please feel free to reach out. We can set up a Teams call. We can talk about it. I can just email back and forth with you. I just love it. The quartering of troops. Quartering is important because it's not just that that there is a military there. Quartering means that you're forced to pay for it, either because you have to house them and feed them or they're charging you to do it, right? That has a real economic consequence on you. And connecting it to another document, you have the Constitution. When you look at the Bill of Rights, quartering of troops is specifically called out. That's how much they hated it. That when it came around to the Constitution and they said, we need to change this right out of the gate, this is the thing where we're saying, absolutely never this. That's how much they hate it. Okay. This one, cutting off trade with the world. Trade changes relationships, right? You're cutting off potential partners we could have. You're also scarcity. You're making it so that we have less access to sell our goods and less access to buy goods. And that changes how we can make decisions about what we produce or the wealth that we can generate. Okay. So then you're starting to pull, this is a good one to pull back into your vocabulary about incentives and producers and consumers and resources. Okay. I know I gave you so much. And the part I didn't get to is this lesson plan. I'm just going to tell you about it really super fast. This lesson plan is super awesome because it starts by getting them to understand what makes a community and includes things like infrastructure and that you need things like electricity and plumbing, right? And getting them to label those things. And then in a little bit later in that lesson, it starts to tie in this idea that public goods sometimes can't or won't be provided by private businesses. So that's one of the things that government is for, is to provide public goods. And that those are generally paid for with taxes. And I know 4th and 5th grade, you both have specific standards about what it is that government's role in providing goods is and what taxes are for. So this is a really, really good one. And I have to leave it at that because of the time, but I'll tell you that it's in here. This is where you go to find more. We have tons and tons and tons of resources on our website. It's stlouisfed.org/education. We have a searchable database. You can change the education level. We've got a pre-K 5 band, so you can filter automatically down for 4th to 5th. You can also filter by concept, like, hey, you kept talking about trade and she really rushed through that. You could go click on that concepts and go to trade and see what we have. Also, I know that time is your most valuable commodity. I really, really do. And I respect that so much. So if you're just like, I just do not have time to dig through this stuff, but we're about to talk about this event and I know it has trade in it. If you want to pop me an email, I am happy to give you a recommendation. I'm happy to sort for you because, I spend almost all day, every day in our catalog. So I can save you so much time. Our newsletter, we have a newsletter for elementary school, also middle school, 5th graders. I know you kind of skirt that line a little. It tells you when we have new resources out. It also curates when we have one we think is timely for you. So if you sign up for our newsletter, you can get that delivered to your inbox every month. And then my email is on the screen as well. And I'm so sorry I had to rush through the end. Kim, maybe in the future we can do one just on the declaration part. Sorry we had to rush a little bit, but we need that foundation at the beginning to really get into it. But I'm going to turn back over to Kim. Thank y'all so much for hanging with me today.
I think that would be an awesome thing to do, is to like take a lot of these documents and break them down economically. So maybe, and we could even make we can make our own KVEC economic video thing just for teachers to go in there and learn really quickly and that kind of thing. I think that would be awesome, because I think it was the hardest thing. Of course, when you see, like, you're going to be doing the high school one, what is it? The 26th is the high school.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah. Yeah. And then September 19th is the middle school one, right? So we have 2 more to go. And so you guys, teaching economics in high school was a beast. I mean, it just was. And I didn't have an Amanda. So I'll be really honest with you. I just can't talk about it, especially considering one of my former students is sitting in the room. I mean, it's painful to talk about. I will go, I will ride off into the sunset someday, and that will be one of my guilties, that I'm like, oh my God, I failed him. I failed him so many times. So you guys sign up for that newsletter there. Mary has put the participant folder in the thing, and she's getting ready to put the feedback. My gosh, I don't even finish the sentence, and it's there. That's Mary. But anyway, if you guys would click on that and give us the feedback, we do look at it. Some folks think, oh no, we just get this for the certificate. You're going to get your ELA credit, from this, but no, we do look at these, because that tells us. And I believe there's a question on there that you talk about more of your needs and everything, and you give suggestions. So we want to know that. We absolutely want to know that. So if that idea about Amanda doing all the lifting there, it could even be like a little mini conversation, you guys. Amanda, we may need to talk about that, but Lord, if we do it, it's got to be in like a week and a half, kind of thing. But we'll talk about it. We'll sit down and chat that up. I love it. I love it. So you guys, if you want to give Amanda a little round of applause there, if you'd like to, on the reactions or any, yeah, there you went.
Kim, too, let me just real fast say, you don't need to beat yourself up about it, because there are only 2 kinds of people in the world. There are people who love economics, and there are people who just don't know that they love economics. And I have dedicated my entire professional life to helping people move from the to the no. So in a lot of ways, you're one of my best success stories.
Well, I really am learning, and I can really see it now. I think the hardest thing for me, my gosh, I was teaching economics the whole time and didn't know it. But the big thing I didn't have were those 2 slides. If I had those 2 slides, which, by the way, you guys, if I went back into the classroom, I'm going to tell you right now, those 2 slides that she told you to take screenshots of, those would be posters in my room. So that when I came to, like, when I'm teaching the Declaration of Independence and I get to one of those quotes and I go, guys, and I start pointing and talking and asking questions, not telling my kids, remember, you guys, we have an obligation. We ask the questions so they do the thinking. So don't forget that.